Hi guys, thank you for clicking on this video. My name's Aisha and this is aishaleeanntalks. So today's story sent me down quite a rabbit hole because there are so many stories like this one. A few of these stories I'm actually going to talk about at the end because it's actually unbelievable how many times this sort of thing has happened. So stick around if you would like to hear them. In the early hours of April 1st, 2023, CCTV caught the moment that 28-year-old Jay Webster got into what he calls a silly argument with his best friend, 27-year-old Benjamin Lloyd. This all happened outside Caerphilly Library in Wales. The altercation became physical and Jay punched Ben only once, but then 9 o'clock the following morning, Ben was found dead. Jay and Ben had been best friends for over 2 decades. Since they were 7 and 8 years old, they had been described as being closer than brothers. They had had arguments in the past, but because they had had such a long, withstanding bond, they had always made it up again in the end. Now, I've got a couple of friends who I've been friends with for 12, 15 years plus, and sometimes you do this. You have arguments with your friends, and you might have a little bit of an altercation, but if your friendship is actually true and you've really got a bond there, you can always get over it in the end, unless it's something really serious, I guess. On the night of the incident, Jay and Ben were out drinking together. Jay said that they were 9 out of 10 drunk and that they had been turned away from the pub. They were on their way to another pub when they got into this altercation outside of the library. I'm going to show you a short clip of what happened before the punch, but I couldn't find a video of the actual incident follow on from there. In this clip, we can see Ben take 2 swings towards Jay. At this point, Jay delivered what he calls a warning shot with his right hand to the left side of Ben's face. Ben then falls back and hits his head on the floor with a very loud crack, head hit off the concrete. Ow. This knocked him out cold. He was just laying unconscious on the ground. At this point, Jay was gripped with panic. He runs down to his friend, he sat by his side, wake up, wake up, wake up, begging him to wake up, telling people all around him he didn't mean to do it. Ben was actually led unconscious on the ground for approximately 3 minutes. Now that's actually quite a long time to remain unconscious, and can you imagine the panic going through Jay's brain at this point in time? He's just hit his best friend and he's out cold on the floor for that long. I'd be in a complete state of panic at this point, I think. 2 separate witnesses made calls to emergency services saying that Ben was in quite a bad way, but he refused to wait for an ambulance, attempted to get into a taxi. The taxi refused to take him because, he was drunk and he was covered in blood. When the police showed up, Ben had dried blood all over his mouth, and he said that he didn't want medical attention. He also didn't want to file any complaints. The police then took Ben home, back to his dad's house. His family members were then urging him to go to the hospital and to seek medical attention, but he kept refusing and ended up just going to bed. So his dad kept checking on him throughout the night. Following the incident, Jay went to another pub and he later showed up at Ben's mum, Kay Main's house. Jay then told Kay, "I'm sorry, me and Ben had an argument." At around 9:30 the following morning, Ben's father went into the bedroom and found him completely unresponsive. He tried to perform CPR, but unfortunately Ben had already passed away. Jay was then arrested later that day, and the first thing out of his mouth was just, "He's dead." Like, complete shock. Couldn't believe that, this was happening to him. He'd obviously not meant to kill his best friend, so I can't even imagine what he must have been feeling in that moment. Like, absolute trauma, I guess. Jay told the police that he felt awful, that it shouldn't have ended like that, and that the fatal blow, it was an instinctive one and not premeditated, which, to be fair, I think that's pretty obvious. On the 6th of June 2023 at Cardiff Crown Court, Jay admitted to the manslaughter of Benjamin Lloyd and was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in prison. Judge Tracy Lloyd Clark said that the boys were more like brothers before the attack. She said, "There's no doubt that Mr. Lloyd was very much loved by his family and friends, including you." She then said during sentencing, "You had a disagreement. You had walked away, he had walked away. You were the one who came back. You immediately regretted your actions. I accept your remorse is genuine." Kay Main, Ben's mother, said that Jay and Ben got on really, really well, and that Ben being killed and Jay being put into prison felt to Kay like she had lost them both. She also said that she doesn't hold any malice towards Jay and knows that her son's death was an accident. Following the sentencing, Ben's family said, "We would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for their kind words and gestures. It has been overwhelming to physically see how much Ben was appreciated and loved by everyone that knew him, even by people who had never met him but only knew of him. Ben's death has left an unfillable void in our lives, and the pain will never ease. But we also understand the pain that Jay and his family must be feeling. He didn't set out that evening to hurt his best friend, and it is such a tragedy that it ended this way." Ben loved Jay, and they were thick as thieves growing up. Although we are heartbroken that we have lost such an amazing man, we also know that Ben wouldn't want any malice or ill feeling over such a tragic incident. Detective Superintendent Nick Wilkie said that the case was a tragic incident that ended in the needless loss of life. He said, "The circumstances of Ben's death should act as a warning for others. Just one punch can ruin the lives of both the victim and the person who throws the punch. In a split second, a person can become a killer or can be killed. This is a reminder, if you face confrontation when you're out, please remember the sensible thing is to turn around and walk away." Ben had been described as one of the world's true gentlemen. So before we move on, I would like to read you the tributes. Ben was so happy and positive all the time. He always walked with a spring in his step. A kind, hard-working and generous man who had lots of friends, you would struggle to find anyone who had a bad word to say about Ben. He leaves a large number of family and friends who will feel his absence forever. He was the most amazing son, brother and uncle. He was always joking around and making light of every situation. He was such a bright star in this world, and we are sure he will shine just as bright in the next. While researching this story, I came across so many different stories of people being killed with one punch just in the last 3 years, and I'm just going to share a couple of them with you. There is obviously quite a lot to each of these stories, so I'm going to try and keep them as compact as possible. But if you do want me to do a series going into a bit more detail and telling more stories like this, then just let me know in the comments, and that's something that I would be happy to look into doing. In the early hours of Sunday the 26th of January 2020, a bouncer from Manchester named Nojan Kafi ended the life of 33-year-old student doctor Emmanuel Simon. Emmanuel had been out celebrating a wedding with his friends, and at around 5 a.m. they were at a place called the Dubai Cafe on Winslow Road in Manchester when a fight broke out and spilled into the streets. Emmanuel had his hands up in a peaceful gesture when Nojan tripped over, pushed another man over, and then punched Emmanuel square in the jaw. Emmanuel hit the ground, fell unconscious, and this sparked a mass brawl in the street. Nojan actually ran down to his side and put him into the recovery position while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. The ambulance then took him to the hospital, but unfortunately Emmanuel would never regain consciousness, and he ended up passing away in the hospital 2 weeks later. Nojan Kafi pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. On September 2nd, 2021, a 31-year-old man named Robert Owen Greenhall took the life of a 36-year-old father of two named Robert Smethurst. Robert Smethurst was out in the Lux Lounge in Manchester celebrating his birthday with his cousin. Robert Greenhall was a bodybuilder who was reportedly high on steroids, cocaine and alcohol at the time of this incident. He had described himself in the past as being the hardest CUNT in the Northwest. He was described by others as a violent, wired mess. Earlier in the night, Robert Smethurst had stood on Robert Greenhall's foot, but they shook hands and they just went about their business, nothing else of it. Nearly 2 hours later, around 1:30 in the morning, Robert Smethurst was getting ready to leave with his cousin. They were just putting their jackets on when Robert Greenhall lunged towards them. He hit the cousin in the face with his left hand and then hit Robert Smethurst in the face with his right hand. Thankfully, the cousin managed to break his fall, but Robert Smethurst was hit with such force that it immediately resulted in a catastrophic brain injury, and he was brain dead before he even hit the floor. Robert Greenhall then puffed out his chest and said, "Who else wants some? Who's next?" before then leaving the pub with his friend. Paramedics were very quickly on the scene and they took Robert into hospital, but unfortunately at 2:48 a.m. he was pronounced dead. Robert Greenhall left with his friend and drove his van to another friend's house where he proceeded to kick and punch the door down when he didn't get a response. The pair then went and booked themselves into a hotel, and Robert was arrested later that day. He ended up being sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison, with a further 3 years and 9 months on licence. Another incident of a man being killed with one punch happened on Wednesday, the 1st of June 2022, when a 56-year-old man named David Albert stopped to talk to two women on the corner of Sackville Street and Bloomfield Street in Manchester. I know all these stories seem to happen in Manchester. There are stories that happen other places. It's not all Manchester, but it just seems that the three in a row seem to have been Manchester. Within seconds of David approaching these two women, the boyfriend of one of these women, Jonathan Adamson, came sprinting towards David, David being completely unaware, not seeing him coming from behind. Jonathan jumps up and full on, as hard as he can, punched this old man in the back of his head. This knocked this old man out cold. Jonathan was then seen on CCTV just a few moments later bragging about this punch. By the time the ambulance arrived, David had regained consciousness and he refused any medical treatment, refused to go to the hospital, and made his way back home. 4 days later, David was reported missing. 2 days after this, the police broke into his house to go and search the house for him. They found him beside his bed, laying on the floor. He had passed away. His cause of death had been determined to be as a result of this punch. Jonathan's family actually saw the CCTV footage being shown on the news and they recognised him. They questioned him and he confessed to what he had done. His mum then chaperoned him to the police station. His last words to his mum before he got out of that car was, "Mum, I'm scared." And I am not surprised that he was scared. I think I would have been scared too, but I mean, you did do it. And then you bragged about it afterwards. Jonathan was sentenced to 7 years behind bars. On the night of September 19th, 2020, a crowd of over 30 people had gathered outside of the Waverley Hotel in Bangor, Wales. The police had already been called at this point and they were already going around looking for people that were breaking COVID restrictions or people that were, causing any other trouble within this group. A 20-year-old man named Dean Skillen was out with his cousin. His cousin was having a disagreement with another man, and Dean was trying to act as a peacemaker, trying to diffuse the situation, when a man named Brandon Sillance came up behind him and punched him straight to the side of the head. Dean wouldn't have even seen this coming, and the impact of this punch actually caused his skull to rotate on its spine and caused him a catastrophic brain injury. He was another one that was brain dead before he even hit the ground. Brandon then punched Dean's cousin as well, walked away, and just stood around waiting to be arrested. Brandon ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison for the manslaughter of Dean, and he was sentenced to a further year for the assault on Dean's cousin. And for this last one, I'm going to end by talking about another story of somebody who actually killed their own friend with one punch that happened quite recently. On the 19th of November 2022, 30-year-old Michael Pearson ended the life of his own friend, Scott Acaster, on a night out. The pair were out drinking with friends at the Grandale pub on Sutton Park in Hull. Michael and Scott got into an altercation in the pub, which was quickly diffused, and they just thought nothing more of it until around 20 minutes later when they were walking home. Michael was walking in front of Scott when all of a sudden he turns round completely unprovoked. Nobody expected it, nobody saw it coming. He turns round, walks straight over to him, and punches him straight in the face. Witnesses described the sound of a loud crack as he fell back and he hit his head on the ground. He ended up suffering a real severe bleed and swelling on the brain, and unfortunately he passed away 2 days later. Michael ended up being sentenced to 7 years and 6 months in prison for the manslaughter of his own friend. Like I said, there is a lot more to most of these stories, and there is a lot more of these stories. So if you want me to talk about more things like this, just let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to do so. But otherwise, I'm just going to leave it there, and please, people, remember, don't punch people. Thank you for watching this video. If you're new and you don't know what I do here, I tell hardship stories. So I tell celebrity stories, I tell everyday people stories, I tell stories that I find in the news. So if you have a story that you'd like to share, or you have something that you'd like me to talk about, you can contact me via my email, which I'm going to leave linked in the description box down below. You can also just leave me a comment and I reply to the comments. Up to you. Otherwise, please look after yourselves and remember to be kind to everybody around you, because you never know what someone else might be going through, and a little bit of kindness and compassion can go a long way. Bye bye for now.